Welcome to another episode of Brewing with the Elder.
Okay, adventurers, so we're here in my workshop. Really, it's my kitchen. But you want to know everything there is about invisible spirits. So, today, I'm here to tell you everything you need to know. The first thing we need is a giant pot. Now, I know what you're thinking. That's just a soup pot. Oh, no. This is 5 gallons. Make a whole lot of ethanol with this right here. So you need yourself a nice big pot. This is called a brew kettle, so to speak. Alright, now, we're going to fill this thing up with water here in a second. We're going to get that water nice and hot. I'll tell you why in just a moment. Alright, now, other things that we absolutely have to have. We need some form of a sugar. Now, the sugar is important because that's what gets turned in to the invisible spirits. Right. And it's the invisible spirits that you're after. So, you can use things like corn. This is dent corn. We use it to feed cows and pigs. Makes them nice and juicy. I love a good fat cow. Steak. Anyways, so you can use your corn. You gotta mash it up, grind it up. You can even use some corn sugar if you like. What we're gonna do today, because it's the easiest way to do it, is take simple, regular old sugar. And this is what's going to turn into the invisible spirits. Now, what has to happen is a little tiny creature, this guy right here. This is yeast. These little tiny guys right here and these little pellet-looking things. And these guys, they eat the sugar, and they're the ones who create the spirits. Yes. So what we have to do is make sure they get all the food and minerals that they need to create our wonderful, wonderful invisible spirits. So, other things we will add to the mix. Amylase, which helps break down the sugar into smaller bits to make it easier for the yeast to eat. And we've got yeast nutrients. And inside of here are different things the yeast need to, well, make plenty more of themselves. So, one thing to mention, because over at the Mages College, I know you guys like to eat a lot of bread. Well, you'd be using a different type of yeast for that. This right here, this is bread yeast. And you use that to make all of your wonderful cakes and your white breads and all the fluffy stuff. But what we're using is a special yeast. And the difference is, once you get a certain amount of invisible spirit in your mixture, well, these guys, they croak, they die, they can't handle that much spiritual pressure. But these guys have been training in a hyperbolic time chamber for a long time, and they can handle the spiritual pressure from all of the invisible spirits. So, you gotta make sure you use the right yeast. That's very important. So, step 1, it's fairly simple. You gotta boil water. Maybe you use some wood fire. Maybe you use a blowtorch. Maybe you use a little bit of your mage's magic. I don't know how to do any of that stuff. I'm just a regular old fellow, right? But maybe your archmage could be like, fire or something. But you gotta boil your water. So that's what we're going to do first. But we gotta put water in there. So now comes the most boring part of all. Boiling water. So you have to make sure that absolutely everything is sanitized. Even the stirring paddle here, which I use to stir the mash and the grains if I'm making different types of invisible spirits. I sanitize this every time I pull it out of the pot. And that's to keep any of the bacteria and other things in the air from infecting my batch. We don't want that to happen, because there's all sorts of things floating in the air, from bad bacterias to good bacterias to fungi to pollen and dust and all sorts of stuff floats in the air. It kind of creeps me out sometimes. Anyways, the point is, you have to be very careful about not introducing any microbes that you don't want in here. All we want growing in here is yeast. That's it. Just yeast. Yeast and sugar and water, and then the invisible spirits that they create. So, keep that in mind. Now that the water is... Oh, that's hot. Now that the water is boiling, that's to kill off any bacteria that may have been in your water. So if you got your water out of the river, probably not a good idea, but at least this kills anything that might have been living in it. It also makes it a lot easier to get all of the sugar dissolved in the water. So we got 5 pounds of sugar here and 5 gallons of water. Now there's an important thing to note. You don't want to go more than a gallon to every pound of sugar. Because if you add any more sugar, you actually kill everything in there, including the yeast, and you don't want to do that. So if you go much over that 1-to-1 ratio, 1 pound to 1 gallon of water, sugar becomes a preservative, which is why on the jars of jams and jellies, they're called preservatives. Because we added so much sugar in there, it kills everything. I mean, imagine just force-feeding bacteria sugar until they can't go no more. That's basically what happens. Not really, but kinda. Anyways, so now that we've got some boiling water, it's time to add 5 pounds of sugar for our 5 gallons of water. Now, the important thing is once you've added your sugar, you gotta make sure you bring it back up to boiling. And that is simply because there may have been microbes in your sugar. Maybe you were using a corn mash, maybe you were using a rice mash, whatever you were using. Sometimes there's microbes living on them, and you want to make sure you kill all of that before you add your yeast later. So, we've got to bring this back up to boiling. It'll also help mix the sugar in nice and get it nice and clear. Okay, so now the sugar and the water are both boiling again. We know this is sanitized. Nothing's going to live in there, including yeast. So what we don't want to do is add yeast yet. It's not time. What we need to do is remove this from the heat, and then we need to rapidly cool this. The best way to do it is to rapidly cool it using a coil. However, if you're not going to be consuming any of the invisible spirits and you're just looking to make fuel, which is what we're doing, we're looking for boom, right? Right. So, in that case, you can simply put the lid back on the pot and let it cool. Once it's cool and it's ready to enter in to this right here, this is a carboy. So, we got everything into our carboy here, and now is the important part. We've allowed this to cool as much as it needs to cool, so we can start adding the important little bits, which is our yeast, specifically for making invisible spirits. Amylase, to help break down the sugars, to make it easier for the yeast to make their invisible spirits. And some yeast nutrient to keep the yeast alive and to help them reproduce more. Now, it doesn't matter how much yeast we really add to begin with, because due to exponential growth, this thing will go from clear to murky, and it will be completely filled with the progeny of the first spoonful you put in. So I'm going to put about a tablespoon in here to get us started with enough of the amylase and other things to get our yeast going. Now, the important thing to mention is that you have to cap off your bung. Cap off your carboy here with a bung, and this little mechanism right here. Now what you do, and this is where the science comes in for real, you have to make sure you cap off the top. But because the sugar is getting turned in to CO2 and ethanol, we have to allow the CO2 to go somewhere, otherwise that will explode. And we don't want any explosions inside of, well, wherever we happen to be making our invisible spirits. So, you put this on here, you notice there's a hole right there. And you fill this here up with water so nothing can get down inside of your carboy there. And this allows water to bubble up. Boop, boop, boop. CO2 to bubble up, not water, my apologies. CO2 to bubble up. And keeps other things like bacteria and fungi and pollen and dust and all of the nasty stuff from going in. So, we're going to add our yeast, our nutrients, our amylase, and we're going to cap this guy off, and we're going to let the yeast do the work. And voila, there you have it. In a week's time, this will be ready to be turned into invisible spirits. I'll see you.
Okay, let's go ahead and cover what the village elder just went over. So, the ingredients for fermentation are water, yeast, amylase, which is an enzyme. It's a naturally occurring enzyme that actually breaks up sugar molecules into smaller chains. So, generally, sugar is C6H12O6. Well, it can actually break those C6s into C3s, so it's easier for the yeast molecules to munch on and turn into ethanol. And then you need a sugar source of some sort. So the sugar is the carbon source that's being turned into the ethanol. And that can be in the form of a lot of different things. Sugar and other different hydrocarbons, mainly carbohydrates, is what we're looking for in fermentation. Things like starch, cellulose, and glucose and fructose. Those things are generally things that yeast will go on ahead and attack and eat and turn into ethanol. Now, the simplest and easiest thing for them to go after is glucose. So the closer you can get your starter material to look that way, the easier time the yeast is going to have, and the better yield you will get when it comes to creating ethanol, which is our invisible spirits. Speaking on that point, the reason it's called invisible spirits is because ethanol is clear, and it has been called spirits traditionally for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. It's a traditional way to speak about ethanol. So anyways, that's where that comes from. So anyways, the different sources of sugar that you can use to make ethanol, this is not an exclusive list, meaning there's a lot of other things that you can use. But corn, rice, barley, chickpea, rice, potatoes, beans, carrots, regular cane sugar, honey, anything that has sugar in it can basically be turned into ethanol. So the other thing, one of the other things that was mentioned by the village elder was boiling the water. So the first thing we have to do is boil the water with the sugar. I prefer to bring the water up to boiling first so that the sugar more easily dissolves. It doesn't burn on the bottom. But the idea is that you're trying to kill all of the bacteria and other creatures that might be living either in the sugar or in the water or floating in the air while you're boiling this. So boiling is essential because what can happen is that bad bacteria can come into your mix. It can compete with your yeast. It can infect your yeast. It can make them sick. It can create harmful byproducts. So some of the bacteria may be harmful to you. They may be harmful. They actually might create harmful chemicals that you don't want to come in contact with. So there's a lot of reasons why you want to make sure that your wort, which the wort is the sugar, the water, and the yeast, aren't infected. So in order to keep your wort from being infected, before you add that yeast, you have to boil it, kill everything in there. The boiling additionally will help break down the sugar and help it dissolve into smaller sugar molecules. If you're using things like corn and barley and things like that, boiling actually helps further break down the starches and cellulose in the plant material and helps it essentially get eaten by the yeast a little more easily. So boiling is a very important thing to be doing when you're working with ethanol and bacteria. The other thing to mention is you want to make sure you sanitize everything, and the elder mentioned that as well, and it's for the same reason. You don't want to infect your wort. Now, the proper sugar ratio for what we're doing is 1 pound of sugar to 1 gallon of water. Any more sugar than that, you actually create a scenario where bacteria and fungi, including yeast, will not be able to live or grow inside of it. The reason is once you get too much sugar in the water, there's a process called osmosis. And if you have a semi-permeable membrane, which most of your bacteria are little tiny cells, so they have a semi-permeable membrane, meaning things can sort of kind of pass through it, kind of like your skin and other things. Well, if you have more water inside of your body or inside of your little bacterial cell body than is on the outside of your bacterial body, and let's say there's a whole lot less water on the other side, it will actually suck the water through the membrane and dehydrate the cell and kill it. And we have been using this technique to preserve food for a very long time. Your jams and jellies don't have salt in them to preserve them. They don't have some weird chemicals to keep them from being infected by different bacteria. There's so much sugar in there that bacteria can't live. Now, that's not all bacteria, but most have a hard time. So, the process of adding a ton of sugar to things is toxic for a lot of reasons. So anyways, the proper ratio, if you go any more above a pound to 1 gallon, it's not recommended. Rapidly cooling the water or the wort after the boil. So after you've boiled your sugar, you want to rapidly cool it because the quicker you can get it cooled, the quicker you can get the yeast in. And the quicker the yeast is in, the quicker you can cap it. And the idea is you're reducing the chance of infection from things falling into your pot, falling into your carboy. So this little device here, this coil of copper tubing, is called a chilling wort chiller, or a chilling coil. And you simply run cold water through the tube there. The water never comes in contact with your wort, just the copper, and it takes heat away very quickly. And then you're able to simply put it back into your carboy and get it capped with your yeast, which is important. Do it as fast as you can. So fermentation, what's going on here? Okay, so these little microbes, yeast, they are breaking down glucose and they're turning it into ethanol. And for every every glucose molecule that you have, you get 2 molecules of ethanol out of it and 2 molecules of carbon dioxide. So this is where the bubbles are coming from when the fermentation is going on. And obviously, this is where we get our invisible spirits. These little guys are doing their darndest to make it for us. So why do we cap the bung? Why is the bung on there? Why is the airlock on there? Why are we capping the carboy? Why not leave it open? Okay, so we have to cap it to keep things out, as I've already kind of said. We want to keep fungi and bacteria and other things out of the air, or out of the carboy, out of our wort. We don't want that to get infected. But at the same time, if we completely cap it off, that CO2 is going to build and build and build and build until it explodes. And there's been a lot of brewers out there. There's been a lot of moonshiners out there. There's just been a lot of people out there in the history of making ethanol where they have had an issue with either overactive yeast that have just bubbled up a ton of CO2 all at once, or they've had it capped off too well and pop goes the top and you have a giant mess everywhere, or you have a big explosion, you have a lot of things can go wrong. So you want to have a place for the pressure to go. And that's what the little airlocks there that we fill with water, that's what they do. They trap things from falling in the water, and then the air can actually flow up through the water and bubble out. So it keeps everything nice and clean. So that is the quick review for this section of how to make invisible spirits. And this is just all about the fermentation process and how to get there. So what is coming next is all about the distillation process. And that I'm going to save for next time. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll catch you guys later.